Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do another one of our games, another one of our shows where we take a look at viewer games and maybe viewer questions, although I think I'm going to break it up into two parts. So this one, we'll take a look at some of the viewer games, and next time we'll look at some more of the viewer games and add some questions as well. Okay, so we begin with an entry from Gooey Jim, who's approximately 2000. And he was black in this game and came up with an interesting idea for how to meet the bird opening. So let me flip the board here for you. And okay, after f4, d5, knight f3, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, all very standard. He played h5. And I find this kind of interesting, and it seems to me that there are maybe two ways that we can handle this, two interpretations of it. One way is what he tries, and he's using it as something kind of like a Yugoslav attack against the dragon. So he wants to play h4, put the bishop on g4 or f5, play queen d7. So let me arrow all this stuff here. So something like this. And then try to just hack the white king to bits over on the king side. Now, it's not impossible for something like that to work, but ultimately, I think that white should be okay. A second plan is to simply use this guy on h5 to fight for the light squares. So maybe we'll play knight h6 and knight f5, or bishop g4, bishop f3 first, and then do that. And I think this is a reasonable plan too. So kind of like a modern defense, actually. So I think both interpretations are okay. The normal moves, so to speak, in this position would be knight h6, or knight f6, and I think both of them should give black a perfectly fine game. Okay, so we played h5, d3, and so here I think the plan that I would prefer is probably knight to h6, and if castles then d4, and knight f5, and I think this position is equal. Okay, so Gooey Jim went for a more attacking approach, or more, let's say, a more dynamic approach, certainly. So knight c6 is at least intimating that he wants to play e5. Whether that's so fantastic for him, I'm not positive, but it is at least interesting. And maybe white can consider knight to c3 here as one possible option. On d4, knight to e4, and okay, I mean we basically again have something. We basically have a reverse Dutch. Another possible move is to castle, and I should say the point of knight c3 is we're preventing e5. Okay, so on castles, then again black can play knight h6 and take it positionally. h4, knight h4, rook h4 is kind of entertaining. I try to make it work, but I don't think it will. So if gh, e5 takes, and now neither bishop takes e5 nor queen takes h4 is good enough. So for instance, if bishop e5, then queen e1 defends the pawn, and white's clearly better with an extra exchange and a pawn. Or if queen h4, bishop f4, bishop e5, takes. Here, white can throw away the game very quickly with bishop takes d5, when both queen to d4 check and knight g4 are crushing, but simply queen to e1. And again, black just doesn't have enough. One funny line is queen d4 check, queen f2, takes, and now we don't have to save the rook. We can just play bishop takes d5, because this is absolutely devastating for black. Well, black will be devastated. White gets to enjoy the devastation. Okay, so in the game, white tried another move, which is kind of interesting. So he plays d3, and then he plays d4 the next move. And this stops e5 all right. On the other hand, it's giving up the e4 square. So I would be inclined to play as black did with knight to f6, although I would vary later. So I would be more eager to stick this knight on e4 than he apparently was. But also, he could try h4, and on knight h4, then perhaps he can take on d4 one way or another. Maybe bishop d4, and if c3, trying to win the d-pawn, then bishop to f6. So this looks quite okay for black. Maybe rook takes h4, but this seems maybe overly speculative. But you know, it's It's fun to play like this. Whether you can get away with it or not, who knows? And maybe e5 is not best. Maybe you can play more directly than that. You can consider taking on d4 or playing e5. I mean, a lot of fun ways to handle this. Anyway, the game was knight f6, castles, bishop g4, c3, and here I think best is to take on f3. Okay, if ef, then play h4. If bishop f3, queen d7, castles long, which is really what he wanted to do. And on e4, maybe even play h4 with some counterplay. Another possibility is like what he did in the game, queen c8. But he played queen d7, and this is a little bit unfortunate because here knight to e5 is kind of inconvenient. So he had to lose the tempo with queen e6. But even here I think knight e4 and the position is even. So basically I like black's position. I mean, I'm not a big fan of this kind of stonewall approach. And I think that white is just, or black is just, will normally be better or at least equal. In the game, though, he played bishop g2, and then knight to g5 was a good move, taking away knight to e4. And here, white's a little bit better. Okay, so that's all that I really wanted to say about this game. Let me go on to the next one. So this is between Greg Hamer and Graham Cridland. Cridland is the one who submitted it. And he's basically curious about a plan that he devised in the opening, and I think it was a very good plan actually. So we have a Rossolimo variation, and here white maybe goes a bit astray with bishop c6. Better to just keep this and play kind of a Ruy Lopez style position if possible with bishop c2 and d4. So after this and then d5, I think white really has nothing in this variation. Probably e takes d5 is the best trying to open up the board a bit, but after rook e1, bishop e7, I think this is a good move, so we just close the file we're developing, and dc, and then de. So this whole idea was quite good. So I mean, dc5, yeah, if black has to play bishop c5 right here, then that's just bad because of e takes d5. So de is forced, takes, rook e4, bishop c5, b4, and bishop to e7. And no, I think this is actually quite good. And I don't really like b4 very much, I think. What I would be concerned with most with white is the plan that black, in fact, well, there are two things I'd be concerned about. So one is this bishop on c8 becoming some kind of a monster piece, since white really has no minor pieces that can combat this guy. Secondly, black has the intention of playing f6 and e5, which is, I think, very good for him. The pawns there will restrict white's minor pieces considerably, and they give more options to the light squared bishop, which is unopposed. I mean, again, white has no pieces that can really fight this, so black should seek to maximize the effect that this piece can have in the game. So what I would try to do with white, as much as possible, is to try to prevent this plan. So I would look for ways to achieve f4 quickly, either as a preventive measure or to undermine the pawn as soon as it got to e5. And, if I can make it work. Okay, so b4 happened. Bishop to e7 I think is good. Not the only move, but it's a good move. Bishop b2, and now f6 and e5. And black is playing excellently. So here, bishop f5 and knight c6. It would be nice to play knight to e6 so we can put the knight on f4, or maybe on c5 in some case after a5 if the b pawn moves, but knight h4 is pretty inconvenient. So knight c6 is correct, a3. Here I would kind of prefer to queenside castling the move king f7, keeping the c file open for a rook, especially if white wants to play c4, so that way the pawn can be more easily targeted. But castling isn't a mistake. c4, but here I think black does play inaccurately. What do you think black should play in this position? So take a moment, try to figure it out, and remember, there's always kind of two ways of looking at this, or two things to keep in mind. One is to figure out what it is you want to achieve, but the second is to realize, of course, what white wants to achieve and try to thwart that. So from that standpoint, I think b6 is the best move. Because after the move played in the game, bishop to d6, we're actually inviting white to play something that I think benefits him. c4, and then knight to c4. And now this knight is good, and he's got a little extra space on the queen side and can maybe try gradually to, get these pawns rolling and work up a little bit of an initiative over there. In the game with knight to b3, okay, now it's not quite so good. The knight's going to the wrong square. So bishop to c7, b5, and now black plays a good move, knight a5. So not taking, but leaving this pawn on c4 is a bit of a weakness. And as we'll see, white ends up with his queenside pawns on light squares, which just makes them vulnerable to this monster bishop on f5. Okay, so here, white played rook to c1, takes, rook d3. Okay, maybe he could have doubled first with rook to d7, and then, rook f to d8, and then rook to d3 or rook to d1. But rook d3 is okay. Takes, a4. Again, all these pawns on light squares asking to be devoured by the bishop. So rook to d8, knight e1. Here, probably the best move is bishop to e2. And for instance, if bishop c3, then rook d1, takes, a5, bishop to b3. And these pawns are not destined for a long life. Okay, so bishop to f5, bishop c3, king b8, c5. So it gets it off of a light square, but after rook to d5, it's weak in any case. Bishop e7 is certainly very good, and this would win. But king c8 followed by king d7 is also plenty good. A5 is also good, just to fix the pawn on a light square and to keep it from helping the pawn on b6. But black is just winning here, and the rest is kind of a mopping up operation. So, this plan in the opening with f6 and e5, it doesn't just win or anything, but it gives white an edge, or it gives black an edge, excuse me. And certainly around here, I don't want to say, okay, at this move exactly, the advantage turned into a winning one. But, basically in a position like this, it's very, very difficult for white to stay alive. So many weaknesses, no counterplay. This pawn formation just does let me use a different color, just does a fantastic job of leaving these pieces really just impotent. They have no targets, they have no scope, and it also restricts the white rook for that matter. So the e-file is closed for business too. So very nice position to win by black. Maybe some little improvements here or there were possible, but basically, it chose a good plan, and it was very effective. Okay, so let's go on to the next game. All right, so this is a game played by Nucleus with black against some anonymous player, both about 1800. And here we have a position where black is up a pawn, more or less for nothing, but it's also not quite, well, it's not a trivial win, though. And for a few reasons. So one, of course, is that in queen endings, it's very easy for the defender to get a lot of counterplay, get a lot of checks, and so on. Secondly, white or black can't easily force a passed pawn here. That's going to be a bit of a procedure here. It's not something that can just easily be achieved. And the thing is, to do it, he's probably going to need the use of his queen, but he may also need his queen to help fight against white's threats to create checks. So it's white's move here. You can see moves, maybe not right here, but the possibility of moves like queen g3 to come in here, or queen h6, or if the king moves, maybe the queen come into e7. So there are a whole lot of avenues by which the black king can be really harassed, and if black's queen has to stay in the area to keep him safe, then it's hard for the pawns on the queen side to advance and create a passer over there. So there's a lot of work to be done. To give an example, let's take the previous move. So one idea here, when I was looking at the game, was to maybe play queen e6 and go for queen e4 quickly. But the problem is that on queen to e6, queen h6 is very strong, because on king to g8, queen f4, and the threat of queen to b8 check is just is too strong. Not like it's winning, but it more or less forces a draw, because black has to keep the f pawn covered, has to make sure that these guys are both covered, and he can't do all of that. So he can't both guard the back rank and the f6 pawn at once. So this is just equal. So queen f5 was right. Queen c1, covering the back rank. Queen d3. Okay. Yeah. What I can say about this ending in a constructive way is that black has essentially three things to do. So he wants to keep his queen well centralized. He wants to arrange the kingside pawns as best as possible from the standpoint of restricting white's play against the king, obviously. And then third, of course, he has to make a passed pawn. So the move I think that takes care of the king as best as possible is g5, with the idea of putting the king on g6. And the reason why this is so good is that, first of all, the queen, black's queen, will often be somewhere on this diagonal. So there aren't going to be diagonal checks. There aren't going to be any checks on the 7th rank either. And the king is also protecting every one of its pawns, which is also a nice factor as well. So I think this is probably the best setup. And, you know, again, whether it's a win or not, I mean, maybe for some future computer it'll be trivial, but for humans today it's not a trivial task. It's work. Okay, so queen d3 check happened, king g1, and again I would suggest g5. If white plays h3, then no problem, we play queen e4. And if h4, I think the best move is the slightly paradoxical g takes h4. On queen h6, there's no threat, really, and black can play h3, which is a very nice move. White can't take with the queen because the queens get traded, and if g takes h3, queen g6 takes care of the queens, and then black wins with his extra pawn. So, again, whatever white plays, I think g5 is a step in the right direction for black. So he played b6, which isn't bad, h3, but now he blundered with king to g7. And surprisingly, queen to a3 just is an immediate draw. There's no good answer to both queen to e7 check and queen takes a7. So the game went king h6, queen a7, queen c3, queen b6. White could win, or black could win the a pawn, lose the c pawn, no hope of a win there. So he tried queen e1 check, king h2, queen f2, but after a4, the fact that black is up a pawn is really meaningless. I mean, white's a pawn is far more dangerous than any of the extra black pawns. So black just forced perpetual like this, and draw agreed. What he should have done, going back, instead of king to g7, was to play queen e4. So again, queen h6 is not really a threat here because black can always play king to g8 or g5 for that matter. And on queen to a3, then queen e7, queen a4, queen d7, all the pawns are covered, queen a3, and now g5. And black can slowly start to push his way forward, but you know, it's not a winning advantage yet, or at least practically speaking, it's not a winning advantage yet. There's a lot of work still to be done. Okay, the next game is a pretty rich one, but complicated enough that I think I'll put off till next time. So, no, actually, I will discuss it this time. So sorry about that. So this is a game, Qatar against, or Qatar against Fred G. Both players are experts, good players. And some very interesting tactics in this game. So I'll kind of go through the opening fairly quickly, and then stop a little bit on some of the more interesting tactical moments. And it'll be a chance for you guys to get some tactics practice. Okay, so black threatens to play the Khan or the Paulson or the Taimanov, and white, as is the case with many white players, prefers to avoid this and plays a closed line. Now, white can still play d4 and go into that. And there's even a little trap. I mean, I've played this in Blitz before, and a lot of players will play bishop to e7 here, which is just inaccurate, if not an outright error, because of knight c6, b c6, e5, with a very pleasant position. So the right move is either bishop to d7. Well, either move could be played, or queen to c7. And on bishop to d7, for instance, white has a choice between a4, a restraint policy move, or rook to e1, which makes options like knight to d5 available at some point, potentially. Okay, but white, again, was resolute in wanting to avoid these kinds of open Sicilians and played d3. And after bishop e7, he chooses this plan, which was popularized by Morozevich, not in this exact position, but in some similar ones, of playing knight g5, with the idea of f4. So h6, knight h3, and f4. Okay, now here white played f5, and after e5, chose knight to d5. White's thematic plan here would be to go for g4 and push for g5, but with black's king not having committed to castling kingside, this is at least a questionable plan. It may not be terrible, but it's a little bit. Well, it takes a little bit of intestinal fortitude, let's say, to play like that if the opponent's castled queenside. But in fact, with white's extra space there, it may be playable all the same. Anyway, white played knight to d5, which is a little bit unfortunate. It's not bad, but it's kind of unfortunate to not be able to keep piece control over that square. Anyway, knight d5, e d5, knight d4. Here, white probably should have played bishop to e4. Although, I don't know, maybe g6. Well, okay, this is already kind of unclear. So we could have some kind of crazy position. No, this doesn't work. Okay, I was trying to play queen h5, but yeah, just bishop f1. Could rook f7 work? That would be fun. So king f7, queen h5, and this is probably just demolition. I mean, that's checkmate. And on king g7, bishop h6, king f6. Well, where's the mate? There must be one somewhere. Probably just queen takes h3 is sufficient, followed by rook to f1. This has to be winning. And if king h8, then bishop f8 is mate. Okay, I don't know if that was all exactly forced, but it does look reasonably plausible, actually. So, okay, so g6 is no good for that reason. All right, so said white played g4, and now, yeah, h5 would have been kind of troublesome for white. His kingside's falling apart here. But instead, black castled queenside, and now white gets to take over the initiative in a big way. So c3, a4, b4, here comes everybody, and black really can't keep the lines closed over there. Okay, he tried king to b8, now bishop to e3, knight c8, queen b3, rook d to f8, and c4 now. Okay, and in this position I think white has a better move than he played, although I certainly understand and appreciate the way he played. So he played knight f2, but I think he can actually play bc first, and then play knight f2. And the point is that knight to d6, which is normally extremely desirable, is just destroyed by queen to a3. And the c5 pawn is falling because if anything, black is going to be even worse after b6, a5. I mean, he's already lost, but now he's lost plus. I mean, this is a disaster for black. So after knight f2, probably bishop to g5 is best, then takes, knight e4, and if f6, rook f to b1 is again crushing. Threats knight takes c5. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's not knight takes c5 because queen c5 is checked, but king h1 maybe, and then knight c5 is a threat. d6 is a threat, and knight to d6 is no good because of takes. Queen takes, and then queen b7 mate. So black here should just play knight to d6 straight away, but after knight g5, white's up a pawn for basically nothing with a good position. Okay, in the game, white played knight f2, cb, a5, it's a good move, g6. Here white played f6, which I wouldn't say it's a full-fledged error, but I don't like it as much. So white's trying to keep the kingside kind of bottled up, even at the cost of a pawn, while his queenside attack keeps going. But I think it would be better to play either fg and queen b4, and keep material equality, and also get rid of black's f-pawn, so there's no f5 to worry about later on, or to play knight e4 and take back this way. And this really keeps black pretty well bottled up. The g file opens, but white can neutralize that very easily with king h1, and the bishop is easily defended. Okay, so after f6 takes, here I prefer queen b4, but he played knight e4. And, I mean, this is of course what we want to have. We want the knight on e4, but again, I think it was much better in this version. In this version, after bishop to g5, f5 is coming. So for instance, if bishop f2, trying to keep this great bishop, then takes, queen b4, f5. So white played bishop g5, hg5, queen b4. But now even here, maybe f5 could be interesting. So not letting this knight stay on its good square and trying to grab some space on the king side. Okay, after bishop takes g4, white played a good move, rook f6. And although black is 2 pawns up, his position is really very difficult. Okay, this pawn's hanging, not that it's a very important pawn. This pawn, which is important, is hanging as well. Rook to b1 is in the air, c5 is in the air, and all of this put together spells a lot of trouble for black. So we played bishop f5, knight d6, and here he should have played bishop takes d3. And this, I think, at least keeps him alive. After knight e4, queen c4, takes, knight c5. White has tremendous compensation for 3 pawns. I mean, he's threatening knight to d7, he's threatening d6, he's threatening rook b1, and after rook to b1, there's pressure on b7 with the bishop, knight, and rook. There's the possibility of taking on a6. I mean, you can see, all of white's pieces are just beautifully placed. And black's king is, a bit vulnerable, certainly. But, it's still 3 pawns. So, black can probably afford to be a bit generous if it means he can trade off a lot of white's attackers. In the game, we played knight d6, which is a mistake. Rook d6. Here, again, he should probably play bishop takes d3, although after rook c6 first, not allowing queen takes c4, and then taking on a6, white has a pretty serious advantage. But after king a7, rook b6, black is lost. Rook b8, d6, queen c8. Okay, here, white's move. What should he do? In the game, he tried the most natural move in the world, rook to b1. But it doesn't work because black found, well, okay, that's not quite right. He's still winning after this, but it's not as easy as you might think after black's next. He plays e4, and here, if white had played c5, he's still winning with the idea of playing c6. And black will break on b7. And he can't, of course, take because then, it's even worse. So this would have been winning. But he played d takes e4, which looks perfectly natural, and then got hit by bishop takes e4. So the game ended like this. Bishop takes e4, queen g4 check. This is the point. Bishop g2, queen d4 check. And now if king to h1, white even gets mated. So 10 seconds for you to find out how. Rook h2, king h2, rook h8. I guess I didn't give you 10 seconds there, but you probably didn't need it. If king g3, queen f4 is mate, and if bishop h3, queen f2 check, and then rook takes h3 is mate. So going back. White was fortunate to have king f1 and have a closed f-file. So now it's just a draw by a perpetual. And the draw was agreed. But let's go back a little bit here to this position after the stunning blow, bishop takes c4. Now, it is already objectively drawn here, but white could try a couple of moves. So one thing I considered, wasn't my first choice, but I thought about it, was rook takes a6. Now, of course, if king takes a6, queen to b6 is mate. And if ba, I was thinking, well, maybe what happens if we just take everything and play bishop b4 and try with the bishop and 2 pawns to get something against the rook. I wasn't optimistic about it, but it was worth a look. But it does turn out that this is really not very good for white. So after rook f4, the king is cut off, and black will play king c8, king d7, and so on. So sooner or later, white has to play c5, but then rook f5, and it's just over. So 6 check is even losing. The more interesting move, which I spent more time looking at, was d7. And the idea is that after queen takes d7, white has a very good move. Rook a6 check. Again, king takes, queen b6 is mate. And on ba, queen c5 check. And bishop takes e4 is just demolition. Okay, so queen d7 is just losing. Unfortunately, by playing queen c7, keeping the c5 square under control, and hitting h2, he holds. So bishop e4, queen h2, and this is also a draw. All right. So it's already too late for white, but this was the right idea. If he had played d7 here, he would have won. So if queen takes d7, we already know the procedure. Rook a6, king a6, queen b6 mate. If b takes a6, queen c5 check, and queen takes b6 is mate. So queen d7 is no good. This time, well, okay, first we'll also look at bishop takes d7. If this, now rook to b1, and there's no e4 or anything else that blocks up the diagonal, because bishop c6, just bishop takes c6, or even again rook a6 check is killing. Finally, if queen c7, how does white win here? Okay, and notice this is also important that it's important that there's a pawn on e5, so there's no threat to h2. Although even if there were at this point, well, it's not clear. But anyway, there is no queen takes h2. So white has time for rook c6. Little interference motif. So takes, check, here, rook b1, and black will lose the shirt off his back here. It's just over. So that would have been a very nice way to finish the game. You know, unfortunately, after a very nice build-up, white was a little bit careless. But you know, still an easy surprise to miss, especially in time trouble. This e4, bishop takes e4 idea. So a very interesting game, and we'll go ahead and close our show at this point, and I'll discuss the remaining games and some viewer questions in the next one for next week. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.